Hey kids, it is Jay Bird from the KVJ show at 97.9 WRMF. Last week I read you The Hatchet. This week I'm going to read you part 2. Brian's Winter by Gary Paulsen. The morning dawned cold. More ice around the edge of the lake, and the geese and ducks were flying almost constantly now. And after he rekindled the fire, Brian went to work at once on the rabbit skins. He folded the rectangle over on itself with the fur on the inside and sewed up the sides, leaving 2 holes about 6 inches across at the top on each side. Then cut a hole large enough for his head in the fold and pulled the whole thing down over his head, sticking his arms through the holes as he did so. It made a perfect vest. Well, he thought, looking down at himself, maybe not perfect. It actually looked pretty tacky, with bits of dried flesh still stuck in the hides here and there and the crude lacing. But it was warm, very warm, and within moments he was sweating and realized that it was more than he needed and he had to take it off. He set it aside and was about to get back to work on the arrows. He still had to fletch them, but put feathers on the shafts when he remembered the wolves. He trotted up to mark his boundary stump and came around a corner near the stump and stopped dead. Facing him was a wolf, a big male, his head covered with fresh blood. He was holding a large piece of meat with a bone in the center in his mouth, and he didn't growl or look at Brian with anything but mild curiosity. They stood that way, Brian with no weapon and nothing in his mind but peeing on a stump, and the wolf holding the meat, and then the wolf turned and trotted off to the left and was gone. But he had come from the right. Brian thought somewhere to the right as he watched. Another wolf came by from the right with another piece of meat, though slightly smaller, and trotted easily off to the left, following the first one. And Brian was alone. He stood waiting, and when no wolves came, he relaxed his shoulders, which had been training. He thought of what he had just seen. They had been carrying meat, fresh meat. He did not know what kind it was, but it must have been a large animal, maybe a deer, and they seemed to be done with it. Maybe there's something left of the kill, he thought. If I can find it, maybe there's something left I can use. He started off the way the wolves had come, but stopped again. Thought a moment, then trotted back to camp and got his knife and hatchet and fire-hardened spear. Knowing the woods as he did, he knew there was a chance that he would not be the only thing looking at the wolves' kill. He started back in the direction the wolves had come from, and he hadn't gone 100 yards when he came to it. It had been a deer, a young doe. There were dozens around, and Brian had thought of hunting them, but his weapons were light and it was hard to get close to them. So he settled for rabbits and fish and full birds. Quack! She had been the crash he had heard in the night when the wolves had howled. Arroo! And he stopped before the kill to read sign. The doe was on the near side of a small clearing. She must have run out of the far side with the wolves nearly on her, and they had caught her and held her while they tore her to kill her. He shook his head and came back to reality. Most of her was gone. Brian smiled. It's a treasure, he thought, and actually started to salivate, and then smiled more widely as he had a fleeting image of back in the world and what they would think if they could see him now, salivating over what amounted to a roadkill. He would have to work fast. Other predators, a bear, foxes, perhaps more wolves could come along at any moment until he got to the protection of the fire. He wasn't sure he could hold his new wealth. The portion of the doe that was left weighed less than 50 pounds, and he dragged it easily at first, but then, seeing that it left a blood mark as it skid along, and worried that it would be too easy to follow, he picked up the carcass and threw it over his shoulder and carried it away. This he ate for the evening meal, or about half of it, spooning it into thick glops. Ew. And when he was at least back in his shelter, the meat stored safely in the rear, and the pot set aside from the fire for the night, still half full, he felt like the richest man on earth. It was very hard to concentrate on working. Everything in him wanted to sleep now. He'd never been so full, and the shelter was warm and snug, and all he wanted to do was close his eyes and sleep and end the day. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the story. My name's Jay Bird from the KVJ show on 97.9 WRMF. And remember, Bigfoot is real.